Tarot historical archetypes, and at least a tie for the most misunderstood card there is, the Tower. I'm a huge fan of symbolism, which is what attracted me to the tarot in the first place. I can't get enough of wondering why certain visual archetypes call out to us the way that they do, and a lone tower reaching up into the sky is one of them. There's just something innately mythic about it. I like this picture here. It's just really awesome. And just one of many, many cool tower pics I'm going to show in this video. The tower card is, of course, numbered 16. And it's basically considered the scariest of the cards, because it shows a scene of disaster. This is based on the nonsense notion that the cards can tell the future, never intended by the designers, of course. And that scene has been pretty consistent throughout the centuries, although the card, especially early on, did have variations. First, let's talk about towers themselves, like this one here. These were notable things, right? Stood above everything else around them. They were built by the powerful. They were projections of power, a symbol of royalty. This was a mechanism of protection, too. The final place of protection, where you would make your last stand in a castle, was usually a tower in the center, the keep. And this, of course, made it into folklore and mythology. You know, how many times in a story is the princess locked up in a tower? And, of course, that reminds us of Rapunzel. By the way, this is supposedly the Rapunzel Tower in Germany. And, you know, if you just Google image search fairy tale castle, one of the first results you'll get, if not the first, is this castle here in Germany. And what stands out about it? Of course, the towers. Especially the tallest one. And in the 20th century, the architects at Disney realized that is what people think of as a fairy tale type castle. So they designed theirs this way. And towers, therefore, have all of that baked into them as symbols, and we haven't even gotten to the specifics of the tarot template yet. So let's do that. Looking at some pretty early renditions here, and the bottom line is, there is a tower and bad stuff is happening. Destruction is coming down from above, so presumably from God. People are falling to their death. Here in the Marseille pattern, there's the destruction we talked about, including hail, and there's the people falling to their death. Sometimes there's flooding on the ground as well. Just all kinds of calamity, but why is all that calamity being visited upon the tower? And this is really obvious stuff, because the tower is, at least in part, partly inspired by the Tower of Babel. Easily the most famous / infamous tower in the European medieval Renaissance mind that conceptualized the tarot. This image and the next few are all of the Tower of Babel. And remember, really the point of the whole video series here is that the tarot images were not drawn up from a blank piece of paper out of nowhere, nor were they some super secret, esoteric mysticism knowledge known only to a few. No, these were culturally obvious things. And everybody back then, pretty much, knew the story of the Tower of Babel. Part of one of the most ancient patterns in storytelling, a warning about hubris. And annoying the gods, or in this case, a god, and paying the price for your arrogance. Let's read from the book of Genesis real quick. Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth. But, of course, that's what ended up happening to them. That's exactly what God did to them for their arrogance. Made them speak a bunch of different languages, where formerly they were speaking one, and scattered them over the earth. So like I said, the know your place story template. You belong down here on earth, not up in the heavens. But in the biblical story, God doesn't destroy the tower, he just causes the work to stop. So what's going on there? Well, for one thing, I imagine if you asked an average person back then what happened to the Tower of Babel, they would say God destroyed it, even though he didn't in the story. I mean, remember, everybody took this stuff literally, and they knew where Babylon was, so was there some tower reaching practically to the heavens, some unfinished project that people could go look at? Well, of course not. And I'm going to show you 2 prints in a row from roughly the time of tarot's widespread adoption that show exactly what we're talking about. A different version from what's actually in the Bible. The artists depict God destroying the Tower of Babel. And so that, and especially this image here, seems like pretty good corroboration, but this is all still theoretical. So where else in the European mind of the time might the image of God destroying a tower have come from? Well, I'll tell you. In medieval times, the church A tower was often, if not always, the tallest thing in a town, and that included the structures known as detached towers like this one here. And in a church tower, what did you have at the top? You had bells, big metal objects located high above anything else. And this was centuries, many centuries, before this man here, Benjamin Franklin, invented this. The lightning rod, considered a near miraculous creation at the time, because hold on, now man can control the lightning that formerly kept hitting our buildings, especially the taller parts, and causing fires and destruction? And prior to that invention, who would people blame, or at least assign responsibility to, when lightning did cause destruction? Well, God, of course. It was God's punishment. Lightning struck the top of the church tower? God is mad at us. Forget that the tower was the tallest object in town, and had these large metal conductors up there like we talked about. Complicating all of this and adding to the tarot visual was the job of bell ringer, the perilous job. Here's an illustration from 1910 showing a bell ringer getting electrocuted by lightning, because, yeah, that could happen. All the more so because in the charming medieval superstitious mind, ringing the church bell tower helped ward off evil, including destructive storms. Our 1910 illustration is well past the Age of Enlightenment, but we see the same mistake being made. Just meaning going up there when there's thunder and lightning. I doubt in the early 20th century they thought this could ward away a storm. But when it comes to that belief, back in the old days, in the Middle Ages and thereabouts, we know for a fact they believed that. There was a German bell with an inscription on it that translated as warding off lightning and evil spirits. A French one that said, "It is I who dissipate the thunders." There was a 1784 publication trying to get people to see the light, pun intended. It was entitled, "A Proof That the Ringing of Bells During Thunderstorms May Be More Dangerous Than Useful." Author Philip Dray wrote a book called Stealing God's Thunder, where a lot of these factoids are from. Like the fact that, according to him, 121 bell ringers died between 750 and 1783. There's an article online on ANERS.com, called "Why Being a Bell Ringer During the Middle Ages Was One of the Worst Jobs in History." They have this snippet from a 13th century monk who said, quote, "Another priest, this one secretly a sinner, went to ring the church bell to ward off the storm, but was struck by a lightning bolt that tore his clothes from him and consumed certain parts of his body to punish him." So, if this mechanism of ringing the bells, if it didn't work well, it must be the fault of the person who went up there. They weren't righteous enough. It's God's judgment. And anyway, that's probably why the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot deck here, just like the centuries earlier Marseille pattern, shows lightning striking the top of this tower and people dying. Now, granted, they're falling out of the tower. No, we have no data to understand how that came about in the rendition. But the perilous job of bell ringer is probably why they are here. And again, going back to the Tower of Babel, these people are being thrown down from the heavens that they were trying to reach. Because our major thesis, as you can tell, is that the card is a combination of the Tower of Babel and this phenomenon of church towers being struck by lightning. And now, remember I said there were variations early on. Here's one of them. It's a tree being struck down, or being struck by God instead of a tower. So this tarot card could have turned out to be very different if this had stuck. There's even an early version where it's a tower, but it's kind of a peaceful tower. There's a tower, there's a cow in a pasture, and that's about it. The tower card was sometimes very early on called the House of the Devil, and that makes sense because it's being punished by God. But it was also, confusingly, and much more often, called the House of God. You'll even see that name along with the standard calamitous scene, which is odd then, because, why is God punishing his own house? Or the people that are in there? Well, it's important to understand that House of God was a medieval name for a hospital. Because back then, really, the hospital was basically a place to wait, get cared for, and pray that God would see you through, and the staff there would pray for you. So there's a third aspect there to the card, but it's definitely not as big of a player or as big of an influence as the other two. It's just in the mix. This tower symbol, it also appeared in other medieval and ancient games. Seriously, the equivalent of, Monopoly or the Game of Life. And I'm positive this is not in any tarot book that has ever been written. Not that I could read them all. But so you're only getting this here. It was a spot like being stuck in jail in Monopoly. These games always have a holding spot where you get stuck in. Oh, damn, now I'm stuck and the other players can advance without me, and you have to wait that time out. That's what the tower was in a lot of these ancient games. And that makes sense because when you're in the hospital, there really isn't anything you can do about it. You just need to wait. So when you're in the ancient House of God. If this seems a little confusing and contradictory at times, it's because that's the way it was. Again, people did not sit there and design these cards with some overly exact philosophical backing, everything worked out to a T. Remember, it was just a game. The game of life that I showed a few minutes ago, or a minute ago, that's actually pretty instructive because that's kind of what the major arcana sequence is. Except because of its Christian context, it's kind of like life slash afterlife. The major arcana sequence is tracing out a typical life at the beginning, but then it gets into the afterlife aspect, or at least has that in there as well. They just kind of double, really. Once you've died, a card numbered 13, of course, then you could end up with the devil, which was our last card, 15, right? Or you could end up in purgatory, a place where you're kind of sort of punished by God and have to wait. So you have the spiritual version of waiting in the hospital. And yes, there's even one more thing to throw in. Remember that the largest influence on the Tarot Major Arcana sequence by far is the Book of Revelation. Well, when you're reading the cards that way, then the card still works, because in that case, it's an image of the destruction of the earth by God, as foretold in the Bible in the Book of Revelation. And later on, some of the cards we're going to get to are clearly the establishment of the new, better world by God. And that is the Tower card. So it is mostly a representation of punishment by God, but there are so many more layers to that than it might seem at first, because it's the overt calamity, yes, it's keying off of the Tower of Babel story, but it's also God punishing the town, or the bell ringer in particular, you name it, by striking the church tower. Once again, wrath of God, but then there's also this completely forgotten aspect of when you're punished by God only by being forced to wait. That can be both earthly, like when you're sick in the hospital, or spiritual if you're in purgatory, and then it applies to the whole world as well, where the wrath could be God destroying the entire earth, not just the Tower of Babel, not just one town's church or tower. So it's a very fungible and yet consistent symbol. Very interesting, and it's got some nuances that almost nobody knows about. And all of that is tarot-specific, so it doesn't even count the just basic tower archetype properties that we talked about at the very start of the video. Speaking of that, some of the tarot's images have lost their power over the years, like the Hermit. It's still a great image, but it doesn't resonate with people today the way it used to. Well, I think that's not the case with the tower. There's still something about even an ancient tower, like this one, that calls our attention, but then the important thing is we never stopped building these. The materials have changed, and they've gotten much, much taller, but there's always this competition of what country has the tallest building in the world, or which former tallest building in the world has been dethroned. So it's still with us. And that is actually it for the tower. Thanks.